Everybody knows that Microsoft is a great company, but not many people understand why. The fact that Microsoft has jumped at cloud computing and is a leader in that space has helped it a lot. But there's a lot more to this business than meets the eye. Let's explore the business holistically right now. Microsoft was founded by, of course, Bill Gates, who became one of the wealthiest people in the entire world. And we all know that back in the 90s, Microsoft basically took over computing. They dominated personal computing and they also started to dominate business computing. And that's really what started to set them apart. But what does the company look like today? And should you or I invest in the stock? Let's look at a couple facts. I looked at the most recent shareholders letter and annual report from Microsoft, and here are some of the highlights. First of all, is you need to know that Microsoft is split into three main segments. There's a productivity segment, there's the personal computing segment, and then there's the cloud business. Now, the cloud business, which it's pretty amazing because that definitely didn't exist 2 decades ago, is now a third of the business. And the three segments of the business are pretty much evenly split in terms of revenue, and they all contribute very well to the bottom line. Overall, the company made $168 billion in revenue in 2021, and the amount of profits that fell to the bottom line was $70 billion in operating income. Keep watching until the end because I'll reveal what I believe is Microsoft's true secret weapon. Now, there's a lot of people on YouTube and on the internet in general who already have talked about Microsoft's cloud business in depth. So I'm not going to rehash any of that information for you here. I really value your time. What I want to talk about is what I think is an often underlooked part of Microsoft's business, and that is the social media network LinkedIn. As you probably know, LinkedIn is a social networking site where people who are looking for jobs and people who are looking for employees kind of come together and also just generally network professionally together. They have many different aspects to it, such as LinkedIn Learning. You can recruit people, you can market to potential employees. There's all sorts of things on there. I remember the news back in 2016, and it was announced that Microsoft was going to acquire LinkedIn for $26 billion. And I was thinking, like, that's crazy. Why would Microsoft pay that much for a social media company? It's not even one of the biggest social media companies like Facebook or Twitter at the time. And I thought, 26 billion? Like, Microsoft, you crazy. Well, Microsoft is definitely getting the last laugh here because in 2021, Microsoft reported that LinkedIn brought in over $10 billion in revenue. So that's just about half or a little bit less than half of what they paid for it about 6 years prior. LinkedIn almost never gets talked about, I feel like, because, well, a lot of people just don't like talking about work. And the professional aspect of people's lives is something that people often put on when they're trying to show how great their accomplishments are. But it's not necessarily something that people talk about in social circles that much, not compared to things like Facebook or Snapchat. Now, speaking of the other social networks, did you know that LinkedIn has over 774 million users? That's more than Snapchat and Twitter combined. And frankly, I would not be surprised if LinkedIn surpasses a billion users sometime within the next couple of years, especially since in the last year, they grew by 27%. And they're not just growing their user base, they're growing their dollar base. LinkedIn, as I mentioned, made over $10 billion in revenue. That's up 27% from the prior year. So this segment of Microsoft's business is actually growing almost as fast as the cloud business. And I think that's pretty amazing. If you think about LinkedIn as a business model, people are talking about business, right? They're talking about jobs, they're talking about their professions and careers. So people are more willing to pay up for services related to those topics than something like Facebook, where really you're just looking at ads all day. On another note, I want to talk to you about another sign of an excellent business that I see very clearly here with Microsoft. They returned over $40 billion to shareholders in 2021. About $17 billion of that was in the form of dividends, and about $23 billion of that was in the form of share buybacks. They also have $130 billion in cash and only $50 billion in debt. So they could wipe out their entire debt balance right now if they wanted to. And this harkens back to Microsoft's culture from back in the day when Bill Gates was really running things. In the very beginning, he wanted Microsoft to keep at least a year's worth of operating expenses in cash at all times. So that culture of financial conservatism has extended into the current version of the company. Now, we talked about LinkedIn as one side of Microsoft's business, but there are many businesses within Microsoft. They pretty much dominate business software, and they've been making incremental improvements to their suite of software for many years. So much so that companies like Apple and other businesses have not been able to unseat their position as the dominant software player in the business world. And that brings us to what I believe is Microsoft's secret advantage. You see, Microsoft understands its position within the scope of technology businesses. It understands where it fits in, and it plays in its own lanes very well. They run productivity very well, they run gaming, they run social media, at least as far as the business niche of it. And so they understand all these different businesses and how to operate them and make them produce revenue and ultimately cash flow. In the most recent shareholder letter, CEO Satya Nadella stated, "No asset is more strategic than data." And I love that quote because it epitomizes exactly what Microsoft is. Microsoft is an economic machine sourcing data from many different products and many different sources and using that data to improve each of those products and create new and better iterations. Since Microsoft bought LinkedIn, revenue has tripled. When Microsoft entered the gaming space many years ago with the Xbox, a lot of people thought they couldn't compete with Sony and the PlayStation, but they did. When the world started to shift towards cloud computing, Microsoft was at the forefront with their Azure products and with their cloud products. Now, many businesses talk about cloud and how they are trying to get into that space or leverage that space, but Microsoft is going a step further. They're creating separate, specific cloud infrastructures for different industries. So, for example, if you work in finance, you'll have a finance cloud. If you work in retail, you have a retail cloud. That level of customization is really only possible if you have a ton of insightful data, and Microsoft has that data. They can even succeed when they're not first to market. Slack is a messaging app that essentially is what I believe the next version of email, or kind of like a replacement for email. It has these different channels where you can talk to your coworkers. Well, Microsoft came out with a competing product called Teams many years after Slack was launched. And now Teams is installed on so many different businesses' computers worldwide. When Slack came out, large businesses didn't want to commit to it because it was a new, untested product. But when Microsoft came out with their version, they said, "Oh, well, this already integrates into everything we already do because we're already Microsoft customers. Yeah, go ahead and give us Teams, even if it's not quite as good of a product." So that's Microsoft's advantage. They can use data from any one of their products and services to iterate those products and services to better serve their customers. And they really have this foothold in the business world and also in the gaming world too, that they've successfully used to generate lots of cash flow for shareholders. Now, I don't like the valuation so much right now. It's around 27 times earnings, even though the stock has come down a little bit. It's still not at a place where I feel like it's a compelling buy. But mark my words, if I can ever get this stock below 20 times earnings, I would be very happy about that. And that's because Microsoft, from what I've seen, is one of the best businesses in the world. It's literally a cash machine.